Zeven Kaylor moved through the officer's lounge like a shadow, her soft shoes barely making a sound on the polished floor. She carried a coffee pot, replenishing cups without a word or glance from anyone. Her presence was so subtle, so quiet, that it was as though she wasn't even there. The officers, absorbed in their conversations and paperwork, didn't acknowledge her at all. She didn't mind. It had always been this way. Her uniform, pressed to perfection, was devoid of any insignia or rank. The only thing marking her presence was the simple staff badge pinned above, her left breast pocket, a symbol of her position that she wore with a mixture of resignation and patience. In the corner of the room, Colonel Thackeray barked orders across a table strewn with flight plans and weather reports. The atmosphere was tense as he discussed the upcoming VIP transport, detailing the high-profile guests and their importance. Zeven refilled his coffee cup without a single word. He didn't even look up. The conversation continued, unaffected by her presence. For Zeven, this was routine. The coffee girl. That was what they called her. In the sprawling military base, she was just another cog in the machine, forgotten, unnoticed, unimportant. Every day, she moved through the base, performing menial tasks, delivering coffee, cleaning up spills, restocking supplies. It was all she was allowed to do, and it was all anyone expected of her. She had long since stopped hoping for more. The officers saw her as nothing more than a servant, someone to handle the unglamorous jobs. Even the pilots who walked by didn't spare her a second glance. But her eyes, sharp and observant, never missed a detail. She noticed how the weather reports were changing, how the officers interacted, how the tension in the air seemed to rise with each passing moment. Zeven's hands moved with practiced precision, pouring coffee into a mug, wiping away the spilled drops on the counter. As she worked, she overheard snatches of conversations, details about the transport, and the impending storm system threatening the flight path. She paused, her eyes flicking to the radar screen for a fraction of a second. The storm hadn't been there earlier. She knew it wasn't supposed to be there. Her lips parted slightly as if to speak, but she stopped herself. Nobody had asked for her opinion. No one ever did. She resumed her task, but her mind lingered on the radar. She had seen storms like this before, and they weren't to be taken lightly. Her fingers brushed the edge of a napkin as she wiped the counter again, careful not to draw attention to herself. Her gaze stayed fixed on the screen, tracking the developing storm, calculating its trajectory in her mind. The officers continued their chatter, oblivious to the subtle alarm that had flickered in her chest. The silence in the room was interrupted only by the occasional clink of cups and the distant murmur of voices. As Zeven moved to the next table, Lieutenant Farrow glanced up briefly, his face contorting in a mix of disdain and amusement. "Hey, coffee girl, don't get too comfortable," he muttered. "Stick to what you know." His words were laced with condescension, a reminder of her place in the military hierarchy. She nodded once, the slightest movement, her face a mask of indifference. She didn't flinch. She had learned long ago how to disappear in plain sight. As she moved on, her eyes again lingered on the radar, the storm growing more menacing with every passing moment. She could feel the pressure building, both in the room and outside. The officers were too focused on their own tasks to notice the growing danger in the skies above. But Zeven had seen enough. She knew what was coming, and yet she said nothing. For now, she simply poured another cup of coffee, the heavy silence settling around her like a familiar cloak. In the back of the break room, Zeven paused. She placed the coffee pot down and glanced at the clock. It was almost time. Her fingers brushed against her uniform jacket, slipping into the pocket where a small, worn photograph lay hidden. It was a picture of a younger Zeven, standing proudly in a flight suit beside an aircraft. Her posture was different in that photo, stronger, more confident, a smile that had long since faded. The photograph was a reminder of the life she had once led, of the woman she used to be. But now, that woman was just a memory, buried deep beneath the surface. The door to the break room opened, and Zeven quickly tucked the photograph away. Base Commander Alquist entered, his presence commanding and familiar. He nodded at her, a brief acknowledgement of her existence. "Zeven," he said, his voice a contrast to the chaos of the room she had just left. His tone was neutral, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something unreadable. She nodded in return, a soft, almost imperceptible movement. "Weather's worsening. We're getting reports of electrical issues with the transport, but they're proceeding as planned," Alquist remarked. Glancing at the weather monitors on the wall, Zeven didn't respond. She simply watched him, her face a perfect mask of professionalism, while her mind continued to process the storm's growing threat. She turned away and slipped back into her routine. Coffee to pour, cups to refill. But her thoughts never strayed far from the radar screen. There was something in her, something she kept hidden, buried beneath years of silence, something the others had long overlooked. And as the room filled with the sounds of hurried conversations and plans being made, Zeven remained an invisible presence, unnoticed by all but herself. But the storm was coming, and with it, a moment that would change everything. The calm of the base was shattered by the sharp ring of the alarm. Inside the command center, officers scrambled to their stations, their faces etched with sudden urgency. A communications officer's voice cut through the chaos as she spoke into the headset. "Transport Bravo Echo 7 reporting multiple system failures," she said, her voice strained. "They're requesting emergency assistance and diversion clearance." The gravity of the situation hit the room with a palpable force as screens flashed with alarming data. The transport, a VIP flight carrying several high-ranking officers and foreign dignitaries, was losing altitude rapidly. Colonel Thackeray stood at the head of the room, barking orders as he looked over the flight plans. "Get me the latest weather reports now," he demanded, his tone sharp. The officers moved quickly, each one focused on their task. But their movements were hurried, filled with a sense of panic. In the corner of the room, the base meteorologist tapped urgently at the radar screen. "Sir, this storm system, it's worse than we anticipated," he said, his voice tight with concern. He pointed to the screen where a mass of red and yellow pixels danced. Ominously, the transport is flying straight into it. The storm, once a mere blip on the radar, was now a full-blown system that was rapidly intensifying. The room buzzed with tension as the meteorologist pulled up more data, confirming the worst. The flight path was directly in the storm's path, and the turbulence would be severe. The risk of catastrophic failure was real. "This is going to be a rough ride for them," one officer muttered, glancing nervously at the screens. "We need to prepare for a possible emergency landing." Commander Alquist stepped forward, his face tight with focus. "What's the status on the transport systems?" he asked, looking at the communications officer. She scanned the reports quickly before responding. "Their primary navigation is offline. Cabin pressure is dropping, and both pilots are showing signs of hypoxia." The officers exchanged worried glances. The backup crew was also affected by the same symptoms. The transport was on a perilous descent, and no one had the slightest idea how much time they had left. Outside, the winds howled, and the skies darkened. But inside the command center, there was only the hum of equipment and the nervous chatter of military personnel trying to regain control of the situation. The tension in the room was suffocating as the magnitude of the crisis began to sink in. Alquist moved quickly, his voice rising above the clamor. "We need someone who can take control of the situation. Get me someone who knows how to manually override this transport systems." The officers moved in a blur, communicating with urgency. But there was a noticeable lack of direction. They had no one on base qualified to handle this type of emergency. The aircraft's model was relatively new, with specialized systems that even the most seasoned pilots weren't fully trained on yet. The expert who normally handled such situations was off base attending a conference, leaving the base with no immediate backup. The room fell into an uneasy silence as Alquist looked around the room, his eyes scanning the personnel, searching for a solution. Meanwhile, Zeven, standing at the back of the room with her usual quiet presence, was focused entirely on the screens. She had heard the meteorologist's warnings, watched the panic building in the officers around her. Her eyes darted between the monitors, processing data far quicker than the others. The silence in the command center seemed to deepen, a sharp contrast to the growing chaos outside. Zeven's hand moved instinctively toward the coffee pot, pouring another cup. But her focus was clearly elsewhere. As the officers continued to discuss their options, Zeven's gaze never left the screen. Her expression was unreadable, but there was an intensity behind her eyes that seemed to go unnoticed by the rest of the room. When Lieutenant Farrow passed by, he bumped into her, knocking his coffee cup onto the floor. The liquid splashed across the printed flight plans, soaking the paper. A few officers muttered under their breath, but Zeven was already on it. Before anyone could even react, she was down on her knees, blotting up the mess with a practiced motion. "Damn it," Farrow muttered, but Zeven remained silent, her movements efficient and calm. As she cleaned up, her eyes flicked back to the radar screen, and for the first time, she spoke just barely loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "Western approach will avoid the worst cells." The jet stream shifted north overnight. Her words were delivered in a quiet murmur, but they were calculated, precise. The room continued to buzz with activity, but no one acknowledged her suggestion. As always, Zeven was invisible. She returned to her task, moving away from the mess. but her mind was still on the transport. The storm outside wasn't just a passing worry, it was a real threat. And as the minutes ticked by, the likelihood of a successful landing dwindled. Still, she said nothing more. It wasn't her place to speak, especially in a crisis like this. Not in front of these officers who didn't even know her real capabilities. In the command center, the clock ticked down, and as the storm continued to grow, so did the sense of urgency. The officers, trained for emergencies, were now moving with a frantic pace. Each officer seemed to be reacting, but there was a sense of confusion in the air. They were in the dark, unprepared, with no one capable of addressing the rapidly escalating situation. As the minutes passed, Zeven stood there, her presence fading into the background once again. But inside her, something was stirring. The crisis had only just begun, and though no one had asked for her input, she knew something they didn't. This was far from over. The atmosphere in the command center had thickened with tension. Each officer, previously calm and methodical, was now scrambling to manage the rapidly escalating crisis. The screens flickered with increasingly alarming data altitude readings, dropping, the aircraft veering dangerously off course. The noise in the room was relentless as the communication officer shouted out updates, but none of the responses brought clarity or comfort. Zeven's eyes never left the screen. She stood at the edge of the room, almost forgotten, as the officers continued to talk over one another, desperately trying to piece together a solution. Zeven knew the gravity of the situation. The panic in the room only served to sharpen her focus. As much as she wanted to remain invisible, she couldn't stand by and watch these men and women flounder without offering something that could change the course of the crisis. The crew was incapacitated, the systems failing, and the storm outside raged on. These were lives on the line, and despite the fact that she had been nothing more than a coffee girl in their eyes, she knew she had something to offer, something they didn't know about her. Her gaze flickered over to Commander Alquist. He was in the middle of another conversation, his voice low, and his expression unreadable, but Zeven could see the lines of worry tightening around his face. He was a man used to control, but now, even he seemed out of his depth. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air. She couldn't stay silent any longer. She was done being the invisible woman in the corner. Zeven moved forward, her steps deliberate, her breath slow and steady. The officers in the room didn't notice her at first. They were too caught up in their frantic preparations. But when her voice cut through the chaos, it was impossible to ignore. "I can guide them in," she said, her tone calm and controlled, a stark contrast to the frantic energy in the room. There was a beat of silence. No one spoke. No one moved. Zeven's words hung in the air, shocking the room into stillness. Colonel Thackeray turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing as he processed the sound of her voice. "What did you say?" he demanded, his voice sharp with disbelief. The room had grown quiet now, the urgency replaced by confusion. Zeven stood taller, her presence suddenly commanding attention. "I said I can guide them in. I know how to land this aircraft," she repeated, her voice unwavering. There was no hesitation in her words. She didn't flinch under their gazes. And in that moment, something shifted in the room. She could feel it. They were finally seeing her. Not the coffee girl, not the invisible servant, but someone with expertise, someone who could make a difference. Commander Alquist looked at her, his face unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or something deeper. He wasn't the type to easily let go of control, yet here she was, offering to take it, offering to lead them through the crisis. "You're saying you can help the transport?" he asked, his voice skeptical, but with an edge of curiosity. Zeven nodded. "I flew the prototype for this aircraft," she said quietly. The room held its breath. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. They all knew the significance of the prototype, a highly classified transport. But no one, not even Alquist, had known Zeven's connection to it. No one had known that she had been a test pilot, a part of the elite team that had designed and flown this aircraft before it was even released to the public. It had been years since she'd flown it, but the knowledge was still there, tucked away in her mind, waiting for a moment like this. Alquist's eyes widened slightly, his mind racing as he processed the new information. He glanced at the officers around him, who were now looking at Zeven with a mix of confusion and dawning respect. The realization settled over him, and his decision came quickly. "Get her access," he ordered, "now." Zeven moved to the communication station with a confidence she hadn't shown before. The officer stepped aside, parting like the sea to allow her through. She took her place at the console, pulling up the transport's flight data on the screen in front of her. Her fingers danced over the keys, accessing systems that no one else had the clearance to touch. With every keystroke, she became more than the coffee girl. She became the leader. "Transport Bravo Echo 7, this is Captain Zeven Kaylor," she said into the comms, her voice smooth and authoritative. "I'm going to bring you home." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Zeven was no longer a bystander. She was in control, and she would guide them through this disaster. The response from the transport crew was strained, but Zeven could hear the relief in their voices. "Captain Kaylor, this is Senior Flight Attendant Mercer. We've got 2 unconscious pilots and a backup crew member who's disoriented. We're struggling to maintain altitude." Zeven didn't miss a beat. "I need you to check the oxygen supply in the cockpit. There should be a panel to your left with pressure readings. Report back immediately." As Mercer complied, Zeven's hands moved with practiced precision, pulling up schematics of the aircraft. Her mind worked quickly, her experience kicking in as she began to issue orders. "Bypass circuit breaker panel, delta, and reroute through the secondary. Navigation array," she instructed. "Do it now." The officers in the command center exchanged looks of disbelief. They had no idea Zeven was capable of this. Colonel Thackeray leaned in closer, his voice low. "How does she know that?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion and awe. "Because she's the best person for the job," Alquist replied quietly, his voice tinged with regret. For years, they had all overlooked her, but now they were beginning to understand the depth of her abilities. Zeven wasn't just a woman who refilled coffee cups. She was a decorated pilot, an expert in the aircraft they now needed to save lives. Zeven continued to give instructions, each one more precise than the last. She knew exactly what to do, and she was leading the crew through the emergency as though it was second nature. As the transport crew followed her commands, the descent began to slow. It wasn't stabilized yet, but it was enough. They were surviving, and she was the one keeping them alive. Zeven's mind raced as she processed the growing urgency of the situation. The transport was rapidly losing altitude, its flight path erratic. The systems were failing faster than the officers could comprehend, and the storm continued to push them toward a dangerous descent. But to Zeven, everything seemed eerily familiar. She had trained for this kind of crisis. She had dealt with emergencies like this before, but no one here knew that. No one knew the depth of her knowledge or the experience she kept hidden. Behind the coffee girl facade, she quickly pushed her emotions aside, focusing on the task at hand. She needed to act fast, and every second counted. Her mind worked like a well-oiled machine, calculating the best course of action, processing the data that was flooding the command center. The officers around her were scrambling, but there was a stark difference in how they handled the crisis compared to Zeven. While they panicked, she remained calm. She was no longer just a bystander. It was her time to step up, and she wasn't going to waste it. "Transport Bravo Echo 7, this is Captain Zeven Kaylor. I'm taking control of the situation," she said, her voice ringing out through the command center with an authority she hadn't shown before. The words were sharp, cutting through the chaos. She could feel the eyes of the officers on her, some skeptical, others in disbelief. But there was no room for doubt now. "Mercer, I need you to check the oxygen supply in the cockpit. There should be a panel to your left. I need those readings now." She waited, her fingers tapping lightly on the console as she reviewed the schematics of the transport. It was all coming back to her, the systems, the emergency procedures, the flight dynamics. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with ease, bringing up the secondary flight control options, bypassing the damaged systems. She spoke in a steady, commanding tone, issuing clear instructions. "Disengage autopilot and switch to manual override. Set the trim to neutral. Check the hydraulic systems and report back immediately." The communication line crackled, and she heard Mercer's strained voice on the other end. "Captain, we're having difficulty accessing the manual controls. The backup system's not responding. Mercer, listen to me carefully. You need to manually reset the circuit breaker panel. Look for the red switch in the aft section, near the co-pilot's seat. Pull it, then reboot the system. That will give you control," Zeven instructed, her voice calm and precise. She could hear the uncertainty in Mercer's voice, but Zeven had no time for hesitation. The crew had to move fast, or they wouldn't make it. The room around her continued to buzz with frantic officers, but Zeven tuned them out. She was in command now. Her mind was razor-sharp, processing everything in real time. As Mercer followed her instructions, Zeven's eyes never left the screen. She monitored the transport's descent, watching the altitude drop at a dangerous rate. Every second was critical, but she wasn't going to let fear take hold. She had been through too much, seen too much, to let it overwhelm her now. "Mercer, you've got control of the flight path. Now we need to get the engine back online. Switch to backup power, then reroute fuel from the left tank to the right. There's a fuel crossfeed valve on panel C, lower right quadrant. Activate it. I'll guide you through the rest, Zeven continued, her voice unwavering. The transport was still descending, but Zeven could feel the shift. The descent was slowing, the system starting to respond. She wasn't just saving the transport, she was saving the lives of 200 people. And for the first time in years, she felt the weight of her skills, the weight of her purpose. Outside the command center, the storm raged on, but inside, Zeven was a pillar of calm in the midst of chaos. The officers were still processing what was happening, but she was focused. Her instructions were clear, her movements fluid. It was as if she had been born for this moment, and nothing was going to stop her. Fuel pressure is stable. We're back online with partial power. Engines are responding, Mercer reported, his voice a little stronger this time. Good, Zeven replied. Now I need you to level out. Use manual control to stabilize the plane and keep the altitude steady. We're going to have to fight this storm, but you can do it. Her voice was like a steady hand, guiding them through the storm, both literal and figurative. Back in the command center, Colonel Thackeray was staring at the screens, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. He had never seen Zeven like this before. She was no longer the quiet woman who refilled coffee cups. She was a leader, a pilot, and someone who understood the intricacies of the aircraft better than anyone else in the room. His disbelief shifted to something else: respect, maybe even awe. He had underestimated her. They all had. Zeven's fingers flew over the console, adjusting the flight systems, calculating the optimal path for a controlled descent. She was already 5 steps ahead, anticipating the challenges that lay ahead. She was guiding the transport through the storm, and it was working. She was saving lives, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet confidence and precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Altitude dropping too fast. We need to increase speed to maintain lift, Mercer called from the cockpit. Zeven immediately adjusted the calculations, her mind moving with the speed of a well-trained pilot. Compensate with 15% more power to the right engine, she instructed. It's going to be rough, but you can do it. The transport's descent slowed further, and the cockpit crew began to stabilize. Zeven's mind was already on the next step. Prepare for a descent pattern to avoid the worst of the storm, she instructed. We're going to approach from the southwest. Stay with me, Mercer. This isn't over yet. She could hear the crew's determination in their voices, and it fueled her own resolve. There was no room for error. The lives of the passengers depended on every decision she made. She would see this through, no matter what. As the transport continued to fight against the storm, Zeven's steady voice was their anchor. She was no longer the coffee girl. She was Captain Zeven Kaylor, the pilot who had saved them all. The chaos in the command center began to settle, but the sense of urgency was still thick in the air. Officers were still in motion, but the frantic energy of earlier had transformed into a controlled, almost reverent focus. Zeven stood near the communication station, still issuing commands with the same calm confidence she had displayed throughout the emergency. The transport, now under her guidance, was slowly stabilizing. The descent had slowed, and the aircraft was no longer on a trajectory that would end in disaster. Around her, the officers began to shift. Colonel Thackeray was no longer barking orders at the screen. His eyes were fixed on Zeven, studying her with a new level of respect. He hadn't said a word since Zeven took control, but his expression had changed. There was no longer skepticism in his eyes, just admiration. His previous condescension had melted away, replaced by something deeper. He watched her work, absorbing the intricate, detailed commands she gave the crew on the transport. He saw the expertise in her actions. The woman who had once been invisible to him was now the one with all the answers, and he knew it. Commander Alquist, too, had taken notice. He had seen the sudden transformation in her, the shift from a quiet, almost timid staff member to a commanding leader. His eyes flicked between Zeven and the data streaming across the screens. He had always respected her professionalism, but he had never realized the extent of her skills. Now, there was no doubt in his mind. She was the one who had saved them all, and with that realization came a heavy sense of regret. Zeven wasn't the coffee girl anymore. She wasn't just someone who carried trays and made small talk. She was a leader, an expert, and in this moment, she was the only person in the room who could be trusted to handle the crisis. The others may have been trained for emergency situations, but none of them had the depth of knowledge she did. None of them knew the systems like she did. As the transport continued to stabilize, Zeven's orders grew more precise, more methodical. She instructed the crew to perform a series of manual override procedures to regain control of the aircraft's systems. She was in her element, her confidence radiating through every word she spoke. The transport was still in danger, but it was no longer spiraling into chaos. She was guiding it, as if she had done it 1,000 times before. In that moment, Zeven was in complete control, and it was clear to everyone around her. The officers in the command center started to exchange glances, their previous doubts and disbelief replaced by something else respect. They had all witnessed a miracle of sorts. What had been a disaster was now turning into a successful emergency landing. And the woman who had made that possible was the one they had never truly seen. Before, she had been invisible, unremarkable in their eyes. But now they were witnessing a different side of her, one that they had all missed. Colonel Thackeray was the first to speak. Though his voice was quieter than usual, she knew exactly what to do. He muttered to no one in particular. How did she know his words hung in the air, full of awe? He was still trying to process everything that had happened. A few minutes ago, she had been the coffee girl, and now she was saving lives. Commander Alquist nodded, his jaw tight with both pride and regret. He hadn't known. None of them had known. But it was too late to change the past. He had underestimated Zeven. The respect in his eyes was evident, but there was also a flicker of guilt. He had dismissed her, failed to see her for what she truly was. The rest of the officers were similarly stunned. Some looked at Zeven with renewed respect, while others still couldn't quite comprehend the transformation they had just witnessed. How had the quiet woman who never spoke up become the hero of the day? The coffee girl had disappeared, and in her place stood Captain Zeven Kaylor, an experienced, highly skilled pilot who had saved their lives. As the transport finally leveled out, the alarms in the command center began to subside. The crew on the aircraft had followed Zeven's instructions to the letter, and the aircraft was no longer in danger of crashing. The descent had slowed to a safe rate, and they were now approaching a controlled landing. The tension in the command center began to ease, but the atmosphere had changed. Everyone was watching Zeven now, but they weren't just looking at her. They were seeing her, truly seeing her for the first time. The realization hit them all at once. Zeven Kaylor was no longer the coffee girl. She was the leader they needed. She was the one who had saved them, not just because of her knowledge, but because of her unshakable calm in the face of danger. She had taken charge when no one else could, and in doing so, she had proven herself to be more than anyone had ever imagined. The transformation was complete. Zeven's quiet confidence had become the cornerstone of the entire operation. And as she watched the crew on the transport follow her last set of instructions, she couldn't help but feel a shift inside herself. She had always known what she was capable of, but now, so did they. She wasn't just the invisible woman anymore. She was the one who made the difference, the one who saved lives when everyone else was lost. Zeven stood still, her posture commanding, her eyes focused on the screens in front of her. She had proven herself not through words, but through actions. She had shown the world who she really was, and for the first time in a long time, Zeven Kaylor felt seen. The transport's descent had stabilized, but Zeven wasn't about to let her guard down. The storm was still raging outside, and the aircraft was far from safe. The crew on board had followed her instructions, but she knew that every minute counted. They had just entered the most critical phase of the emergency. She could hear the wind howling outside the aircraft as the turbulence intensified, and the crew's voices crackled through the comms, their nerves becoming more apparent. They were holding it together, but the strain was obvious. Zeven remained calm, her mind working with precise clarity, analyzing every bit of data that came in. "Mercer, status report," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "We're still losing altitude, Captain. The crosswinds are pulling us off course," came the reply. The flight attendant's voice laced with tension. "We're trying to compensate, but it's not easy with the turbulence. Engine power is fluctuating." Zeven nodded to herself, assessing the situation. She knew the conditions on the ground were worsening by the minute. The runway they were aiming for was still several miles away, and with every passing second, the aircraft's stability seemed to waver. "Reroute fuel from the left tank to the right. I need both engines to maintain the best balance," Zeven ordered. "Compensate with more power to the right engine, but don't push it too far. We need to get through this storm before we even think about landing," the crew responded, moving quickly, their every action reflecting Zeven's calm and precise instructions. They trusted her now, and that was enough to keep them focused. Zeven's gaze never wavered from the display screens in front of her. She watched as the aircraft's systems responded to her commands, but there was still too much to do. The storm was relentless, the weather conditions rapidly changing with every passing second. She could see the flashing lights indicating more system failures warnings, flashing up one after another. each telling her that the situation was growing worse. But she wasn't worried. She had seen worse. She had trained for worse. Altitude decreasing again. Mercer's voice was back, but there was more urgency in it now. We're almost at the limit of our systems. I need something to bring us back to level. Switch to manual trim and apply full rudder control, Zeven commanded. Not skipping a beat. Don't fight the turbulence. Mercer, use it. Let the crosswind push you a little, then gently correct it. We need to save fuel for the landing. She was giving them more than just commands now. She was giving them a sense of purpose, a confidence in their abilities that had been lacking before. The aircraft shuddered as it battled the storm, but with every small correction, it stabilized just a little more. Zeven could feel the weight of the moment settling in. The cockpit crew was still reeling from the shock of everything that had happened, but they were starting to come together. She had been their anchor, their guide through the turbulence. Now, it was time to bring them home. Speed down to 140 knots, Zeven continued, issuing each command with laser focus. We need to conserve fuel. Our descent rate is too high. The aircraft's altitude dropped in stages. Each decision she made carefully calculated to avoid a freefall into the storm. Every second was spent keeping the plane steady, monitoring the systems, checking the weather radar, and adjusting the flight path to make sure they would make it to the runway. Zeven's mind worked in perfect harmony with the aircraft's systems, like an extension of herself. She was fully in control, and with every passing moment, her calm and certainty transferred to the crew. The tension in the command center back at the base was palpable. The officers watched the data screens, tracking the progress of the transport. The situation was far from over, and their eyes were glued to Zeven's every command. They had all seen her as nothing more than the coffee girl, someone who existed, only in the background. But now, they saw her for who she truly was, a pilot of exceptional skill, calm under pressure, and the one person in the world who could bring this mission to a successful close. As the aircraft's wheels began to approach the runway, Zeven's orders grew even more precise. Check landing gear, she instructed, her voice still smooth and composed. Make sure all systems are engaged. We may not get a second chance. She felt the aircraft break through the storm clouds, the heavy rainfall slashing at the windows, and her eyes flicked to the runway lights in the distance. They were getting closer now, and the landing was still far from guaranteed. The aircraft was far from stable. She knew that, but she had to focus. She couldn't afford to let the fear creep in. Landing gear showing only partial deployment. Came a strained voice from the cockpit. The left gear is still uncertain. Zeven's response was immediate. Don't worry about the indicators. Lower the gear again. If it doesn't lock, we'll deal with it once we're on the ground. Her voice was unwavering. She wasn't giving them an option. It was time to land. The tension in the cockpit was palpable, but Zeven's instructions provided a sense of direction. She knew what they needed to do, and she wasn't going to let them fail now. The aircraft was now just 1,000 feet above the runway. Zeven's voice cut through the tension in the cockpit. Focus on the glide path. We're almost there. Roger that. Captain, Mercer replied, his voice tight but steady. Glide path is steady. The aircraft broke through the final layer of clouds, revealing the runway in full view. The transport was still fighting the crosswinds, but it was manageable. Zeven's instructions were clear, and the crew followed them without hesitation. Speed at 130 knots. Begin your final approach checklist, Zeven said, her voice steady and resolute. Keep it aligned with the runway. Use the rudder to keep it straight. As the aircraft glided in toward the runway, Zeven watched the numbers on her screen. The wheels touched the ground, the left gear groaned, and for a moment, it seemed as though the aircraft might tip. But then, the wheels were firmly planted, and the transport slowed, coming to a halt with less than 500 feet of runway left. The emergency vehicles rushed to the scene, but the landing was successful. Zeven's calm had saved them all. As the aircraft finally came to a full stop, Zeven released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The command center erupted into applause. The officers who had once dismissed her now staring at her in disbelief. They had witnessed a hero's journey, a transformation from an invisible woman into the one who saved them all. She didn't need the applause. The job was done. Zeven stood up from the console, looking at the now stable transport. She had done what needed to be done, and in that moment, she felt the weight of years of being overlooked slip away. The transport had landed safely, and the tension in the command center slowly dissipated as the aircraft came to a complete stop. Emergency vehicles surrounded the plane, but the immediate danger had passed. The personnel inside the command center exhaled as one, their collective breath of relief filling the room. But for Zeven, the calm that followed the storm felt surreal. She had done her job and the mission was complete, but there was still an undeniable weight in the air. The applause and congratulations started to ripple through the base, a quiet murmur of disbelief and awe. For the first time, the officers looked at Zeven as something more than the woman who refilled their coffee cups. Their faces had softened from skepticism to respect, and the murmur of admiration was undeniable. Colonel Thackeray, who had once dismissed her as insignificant, now stood frozen, his mouth slightly ajar as he watched her. He had witnessed her calm, her decisive leadership. He had seen the transformation, the quiet woman becoming the pillar of strength when they needed her most. His earlier attitude had shifted, and there was no more mockery in his eyes, only gratitude. Commander Alquist, too, could not hide the admiration that had overtaken his usual stoic demeanor. He watched as Zeven stood off to the side, her posture still impeccable, yet her gaze downcast, as though the recognition was something she wasn't entirely comfortable with. He had underestimated her. For years, he had let his perception of her define who she was, just a support staff, nothing more. Now, the woman who had been invisible to him had saved the lives of hundreds, and he couldn't ignore the depth of his mistake. He stepped closer, hesitated, and then nodded in her direction. "Zeven," he said, his voice tinged with respect, "you did what no one else could." Zeven nodded briefly, her lips forming a slight, reluctant smile, but the applause, the recognition, it felt distant to her. She wasn't used to it. She wasn't sure if she ever would be. She wasn't comfortable in the spotlight, not after years of hiding in plain sight. Her role, the one she had been assigned all these years, had always been one of invisibility, of quietly observing, of being unseen and unheard. It had been easier that way. But now, standing amidst the officers who had once dismissed her, she felt a quiet hum of discomfort. As the congratulations continued to pour in, Zeven remained still, her eyes not meeting those around her. She wasn't trying to avoid them, but the recognition felt foreign, like an ill-fitting uniform. She wasn't one to bask in the attention. She had never craved praise. The job had been the priority. The lives saved, their safety was the only thing that mattered to her. In the midst of the celebration, Zeven could feel the shift. It was subtle but unmistakable. The officers around her were no longer referring to her as the coffee girl. They called her Captain Kaylor. They respected her. They looked at her as an equal now, not as someone who merely filled their cups or cleaned up their messes. She was a leader, a savior, someone who had commanded the situation with precision and authority. As Colonel Thackeray made his way to her, his face was no longer one of indifference. There was a mixture of awe and perhaps a bit of regret in his eyes. He had never imagined that the quiet woman in gray would become the hero of the day, but here she stood, her demeanor calm, her focus unwavering, just as it had been throughout the entire crisis. "Captain," he said, his voice slightly softer than it had been before, "you've saved us all. We owe you more than we can say." Zeven nodded once, a small gesture that acknowledged his words but offered little more. She wasn't looking for praise. She wasn't looking for anything. Her duty had been to the people on that plane. Nothing else had mattered. As the room slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, Zeven's thoughts remained quiet. The storm had passed, and with it, so had the adrenaline. The recognition, though, lingered like an unfamiliar weight. It was hard to shift out of the role she had spent years perfecting, the role of being invisible. The reality of being seen was still something she had to reconcile. And yet, as she stood there, surrounded by officers who had once overlooked her, she knew that something had irrevocably changed. For years, she had been the invisible woman, the coffee girl. But today, she had shown them all who she truly was. Today, Zeven Kaylor was no longer invisible. And perhaps, for the first time in a long time, that was exactly how she needed to be. The room had quieted, but Zeven remained in the same spot, her posture still and composed. She didn't want to be the center of attention. She didn't want the accolades. She only wanted the job to be done, and for the people on that transport to be safe. And with the storm behind her, she could finally breathe, even if the recognition still felt like a strange, unwelcome guest. But the silence around her wasn't empty. It was full of newfound respect, and perhaps that was enough. As Zeven stood in the quiet aftermath of the storm, a sense of peace began to settle over her. The chaos of the last few hours had passed, but the events still felt vivid in her mind. She had gone from being invisible, just another face in the crowd, to the person who had saved the lives of hundreds. It was surreal, the shift so sudden that it almost didn't seem real. She could still hear the echoes of the voices in the command center, the words of respect, admiration, and recognition. But despite everything, Zeven felt a strange emptiness inside. Recognition had come late, but it had come. And yet, it didn't feel as fulfilling as she had expected. She stood quietly, looking out at the tarmac where the transport was now being attended to by the emergency teams. There was no triumph in her heart. The task had been done, and the people were safe. That was all that mattered. But as she reflected, Zeven couldn't help but wonder if this moment would have felt different if the recognition had come earlier. She thought about the years she had spent in the shadows, the times she had been dismissed, overlooked, and forgotten. Her role had always been small, inconspicuous, but when it mattered most, when everything was on the line, she had stepped up. For a brief moment, Zeven closed her eyes and let herself feel the weight of everything the work she had done, the lives saved, and the journey she had taken. It wasn't about the applause. It wasn't about the recognition. It was about knowing that she had done what was right, that she had acted when others couldn't, even when no one believed in her. In the end, that was all that mattered. Doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. She thought about the people who went unnoticed, the ones whose efforts were often overlooked, the ones like her. How many times had she watched others get credit for work she had done, knowing that it didn't matter because it was all for a greater cause? Zeven realized that while recognition was important, it wasn't the driving force behind her actions. The satisfaction came from the quiet certainty that she had made a difference, that her presence, no matter how invisible it had once been, had meant something. Now, as she walked through the base, the eyes that followed her were different. They weren't looking at her with indifference or disregard. There was respect there, a quiet understanding of who she truly was. But Zeven wasn't sure how to feel about it. It was strange. This newfound attention, this shift in how people saw her. She had always been content to blend into the background, to do her part without ever needing the spotlight. Now, standing in the light, she felt a sense of responsibility. She had earned their respect, but it wasn't something she sought. What mattered was that she had done what she was meant to do. As she made her way toward her office, Commander Alquist approached her, his face somber but filled with a quiet respect. "Zeven," he said, his voice steady, "you did more than we could have hoped for today. I owe you an apology." Zeven met his gaze, her face unreadable. She nodded once, her acceptance silent. There was nothing more to say. She hadn't needed the apology before, and she didn't need it now. It wasn't about being right or wrong. It was about the work that had been done, the lives that had been saved. That was enough for her. As Zeven entered her office, the weight of the day finally began to settle on her. She sat down at her desk, her hands folded in front of her. She had done it. She had stepped up when it counted, but more than that, she had done what was right. And in that moment, she realized that the true reward had never been the recognition. It had always been the knowledge that she had done her best, even when no one was looking. In the quiet stillness of her office, Zeven allowed herself to feel what she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The journey had been long, and the path had been lonely at times. But she had made it, and for the first time, she knew that her value was not defined by the recognition of others, but by the quiet confidence of knowing she had done what was right, and that in the end was enough.